Welcome. You're watching WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma. A new year and a new variant has raised alarm across the world. The Omicron surge has led to new restrictions, fresh lockdowns and new mandates. The United States is also witnessing a rise in hospitalizations. Questions are now being raised about the efficacy of testing kids in identifying this new variant. We'll discuss all this and much more in this special broadcast of the WION-VOA Co-Production. So let's get started. Now, adults in the United States usually catch 1 or 2 common colds a year. They're usually little more than an annoyance. But new research now suggests that they may offer some protection from a virus that's much more dangerous. More details coming up in this next report from Voice of America.
It's a question that has puzzled scientists. Why are some people able to resist coronavirus infection despite prolonged exposure? So researchers at Imperial College of London set out to test a theory that a type of white blood cells called T cells produced by the human body to fight the common cold could offer some protection. Report co-author Professor Ajit Lalvani.
Previous infection with common cold coronaviruses, so these are distantly related cousins of SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID. So that such endemic common cold causing coronaviruses, that infection with those might induce T cells that would be able to cross-recognize and then attack the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so that was the theory we set about to test.
The study began in September 2020, before any mass vaccination programs and before most people had been infected with COVID. Scientists tested the blood of 52 people who lived in the same household as someone infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID. Half of those sampled contracted COVID, while half did not.
And what we found was that those contacts who had pre-existing T cells that were induced by common cold coronavirus but cross-recognize and attack SARS-CoV-2, people with such T cells didn't get infected.
Current vaccines are designed to trigger an immune response that targets the spike proteins on the outside of the coronavirus that are able to mutate and escape immunity.
In contrast, the T cells we discovered that mediate this protection are directed against proteins in the core of the virus, internal proteins, and these proteins are much less changeable. So essentially our findings provide the blueprint for developing a universal T-cell inducing vaccine to protect people against current and all future variants of COVID.
An exciting prospect, but development of such a vaccine remains some way off. Meanwhile, the report authors emphasise that no one should rely on a common cold infection to provide immunity against COVID and say vaccination offers the best protection. Henry Ridgewell for VOA News, London.
To speak about this further, we're now joined by Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo, live with us from Washington. Chris, thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast. Now, as we know, the COVID test positivity rates and hospitalizations continue to rise even as we speak. And in many areas in the United States, both have surged to record highs. U.S. President Joe Biden is saying that his administration is promising to surge COVID-19 testing and make more high-quality masks available to Americans. But what are the specifics involved?
Good morning from D.C. President Biden said that he is directing his team to double the number of rapid COVID-19 tests to be delivered for free to Americans. Now, he's faced intense criticism over shortages and long lines for tests. The initial order from the government was 500 million tests, and now the federal government will purchase 1 billion at-home testing kits. Biden said a website where Americans can sign up to get tests delivered to their homes will launch next week. He also said that for the first time, his administration was planning to make high-quality N95 masks available for free. Now, those types of masks are the most effective at preventing transmission of the virus. And he said his administration would announce details of the distribution of those masks next week. He also announced that starting next week, 1,000 military medical personnel will begin deploying across the country to help overwhelmed medical facilities dealing with staff shortages due to the highly transmissible Omicron variant. The military medical teams will be deployed to the states of Michigan, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Ohio, and Rhode Island, where case rates are very high right now. Priyanka?
Right. Now, Chris, but research seems to show that at-home antigen tests are not as accurate as the PCR test, the RT-PCR test for COVID-19. So what advice do experts have for those who plan to test at home?
Now, the experts with these tests say it's important to test when your symptoms are bad because you're likely to have a lot of the virus in your system. They also recommend testing more than once, saying you should test again 24 to 36 hours after you first test. Now, in 2020, researchers found that people with COVID symptoms, the at-home antigen tests were less accurate than PCR tests, which can take 48 hours for a lab to process. The antigen test actually missed detecting the virus about 20% of the time, but there's no conclusive data yet on how well those antigen tests work on the Omicron variant. And of course, experts say testing is only one part of helping to prevent the spread of COVID, and people should continue to follow these steps. Maintain social distance, wear a mask indoors with people outside of your immediate household, and most importantly, get vaccinated when you can.
Right. Chris Casquejo, thanks so much for all those inputs on this broadcast. Stay with us. We'll come back to you for some more questions. U.S. President Joe Biden and Democratic lawmakers are maneuvering this week to alter Senate rules to allow for debate on key voting rights legislation that has been blocked for months by Republicans. The showdown is the culmination of a fierce debate over the democratic process. Voice of America's Catherine Gibson has more.
A final plea from the President of the United States. Joe Biden on Capitol Hill Thursday, making the case one more time for passage of a major voting rights bill.
As long as I have a breath in me, as long as I'm in the White House, as long as I'm engaged at all, I'm going to be fighting.
After months of failed attempts to pass the legislation in an evenly divided Senate, Biden encouraged Democrats to break the filibuster, a major rules change bypassing Republicans to open up the opportunity for debate.
This is a historic chance to save our democracy, need to protect the fundamental form of American government. And his view is this should absolutely be bipartisan.
But the White House failed to convince Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who is the key Democratic vote needed for that change.
Eliminating the 60-vote threshold will simply guarantee that we lose a critical tool that we need to safeguard our democracy from threats in the years to come. It is clear that the two-party strategies are not working, not for either side, and especially not for the country.
Sinema's argument for compromise puts her in the company of Republicans who argue breaking those Senate rules would be harmful to American democracy and repeatedly have blocked any attempts to debate voting rights.
President Biden and Senate Democrats have been actually shouting at the American people that an evil, racist, anti-voting conspiracy will destroy democracy forever unless Democrats get total one-party control of the entire government starting next week.
But Democrats say this legislation comes at a crucial moment for the United States, as it would expand access to the ballot box for minorities, including African Americans who have faced decades of discrimination and barriers to voting.
If there was ever a power grab, it's what's happening in the state legislatures right now, where Republican legislators are taking away people's sacred right to vote and aiming it particularly at certain groups, people of color, young people, people in urban areas, older people, disabled people.
A variety of polls show many Americans broadly support the ideas in the voting rights legislation, but are divided along partisan lines when it comes to ending the filibuster. Democrats are expected to try and fail to make a rules change this weekend. Catherine Gibson, VOA News, Washington.
We still have Voice of America's correspondent Chris Casquejo with us from Washington, D.C. Chris, thanks for staying on. Now, the midterm elections will be held this fall to determine control of the U.S. Congress for the rest of the President Biden's term. Now, what is at stake for his administration at the polls at this point?
Well, as difficult as it is right now for President Biden to get his policies through Congress, the loss of control of either the House or the Senate to Republicans would all but guarantee a shutdown of his legislative agenda in the second half of his term. Now, control of both the House and Senate is very much in play. Democrats currently have control of both chambers, but are severely limited in enacting their proposals because of a 50-50 split in the Senate, where Vice President Kamala Harris holds the tie-breaking vote, and also the filibuster rule that allows Republicans to block most legislation from ever coming to a vote in the first place. In the House, the Democrats hold a slim 222 to 212 majority with one seat currently vacant. Republicans are favored to win enough seats to take over control of the House in November. But in the Senate, the likely result is unclear. 34 seats are up for election this cycle. 20 are held by Republicans and 14 by Democrats. The overwhelming majority of those seats in play are considered safe, meaning that the incumbent is likely to be reelected. The 6 races that are generally considered competitive are currently split evenly, 3 held by Republicans and 3 by Democrats. But analysts say there is one event that could have a significant effect on the election and turnout, and that is the anticipated ruling on a controversial state abortion law out of Texas, which is expected from the Supreme Court in the early summer.
Chris, my final question for you. Former President Donald Trump continues to claim that the 2020 election was stolen from him despite zero evidence so far to back up this claim. How might this affect the midterm election?
Well, many states under Republican control have already passed controversial new election laws that could make contested outcomes more likely and even more challenging to resolve in the future. Election law experts say this polarization between Democrats and Republicans and their voters makes it very likely that someone once again will question the outcome. They note that this situation is exacerbated by one aspect of the U.S. election system that is very, very different from most other democracies. The U.S. does not have independent institutions to oversee and administer elections, unlike in a lot of other democratically elected governments. The U.S. has partisan elected officials that administer elections.
Chris Casquejo, thanks so much for all those insights, and thanks for joining us from Washington, D.C. on WION. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.